Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on Poseidon. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to talk about the god of the sea. Now we'll see that Poseidon is wild and unpredictable, just like the sea itself. And it makes sense that he's a central divinity in ancient Greece because so much of the Greek landscape is very closely connected to the sea. Many islands, peninsulas, lots of coastline. So go ahead, set sail, lower the oars, and journey with me as we investigate Poseidon, god of the sea.
Like his brothers, Zeus and Hades, Poseidon was born to the Titans Cronus and Rhea, and as a baby was eaten whole by his father Cronus. After Zeus poisoned Cronus, Poseidon was vomited back up, finally starting his life on Earth and in the sea. We know Poseidon as god of the sea, and that he certainly is. But this came to pass not through a particular predilection for water, but rather by chance. According to the Iliad, Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon all drew lots in order to determine who would rule which realm. And so the classic realms of power were more a matter of luck than anything else.
So two of the things that you'll want to look for when identifying Poseidon visually are of course the trident, right? The long spear with 3 prongs on the end. And then also the dolphin, one of the symbols of the sea itself. Sometimes he's also connected, as we'll see, to horses. And so sometimes he's in a horse-drawn chariot in the sea.
In terms of trysts and consorts and children, Poseidon is basically in the same league as Zeus. He's looking for action wherever he can get it, often regardless of whether his love interests are into it or not. With Poseidon's immense power, many of his children become the heroes of Greek mythology, and we'll take a look at some of them later in this lecture.
Now, perhaps surprisingly, Poseidon doesn't have a ton of huge major temples, but the ones he does have are quite impressive. We got the Erechtheion on the Athenian Acropolis, the temple at Sunion on the southern tip of Attica, and some major temples at the site of PAESTUM, ancient Poseidonia, in southern Italy.
When it comes to understanding the nature and attributes of Poseidon, it is best to look to the sea for answers. The sea was an integral part of life in ancient Greece, as most of the region's population lived on or near the coast. And it's easy to see why with the sheer number of peninsulas and islands that make up the area. While the sea could be incredibly effective for high-speed, long-distance travel, it could also be treacherous, with conditions changing seemingly in an instant.
So one of the things we see with Poseidon is that he's very closely associated with this kind of wild nature and unpredictability. And we see that both with the animals he's associated with, things like horses, and also the events he's associated with, things like earthquakes.
Poseidon, for example, is often called Hippias, literally of the horses, as these are the animal he's most closely associated with. And the connection makes sense. Horses too can be wild creatures that many hope to tame for their own use. He's also known by the epithet Anosigaius, or the Earth Shaker, a reference to his connection with earthquakes, which the ancient Greeks considered to be the result of Poseidon striking the ground with his trident.
We see Poseidon's connection with horses all over the place. We can see him in his sea chariot drawn by horses. We can see him turning into a horse to have his way with another goddess. And we can even see him siring magical flying horses. And we'll hear a little bit about that later in the lecture.
If you think of any city from Greece, either ancient or modern, it's likely that Athens comes to mind. And the connection between Athens and Athena is no coincidence. Instead, it's the result of a competition that stretches back to the earliest days of the city. As Athens was just starting out, their king, Cecrops, who just happened to be half snake, half person. I guess Athens was kind of a weird place in those days. Well, their king decided to hold a contest to see which god or goddess would become the patron god of the city. 2 of the Olympians applied for the job: Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, and Poseidon, god of the sea.
So Poseidon thinks he has a great plan here, and he takes his mighty trident, and upon the Athenian Acropolis, he stabs that trident into the rocky soil. And from that rock bursts forth water. What better gift for Athens? But it turns out that it was salt water. Poseidon, you fool.
Honestly, you'd think that Poseidon would have been a little smarter than that, but perhaps he was too busy chasing women to really think it through.
So Athena, of course, gives the olive tree, which can be used for food or for its oil, which in turn can also be used for food or fuel or for hygiene. Nothing like lathering up before a good wrestling match.
And with this wonderful gift, Athena wins the contest. And that's why today we refer to the city of Athens, rather than the city of Poseidonia, although there was one of those too, and we'll hear about it in just a bit.
The 5th century BC temple, known as the Erechtheion, stands on the Athenian Acropolis at the exact site of this supposed contest, the exact site where Poseidon struck the ground with his mighty trident. And right next to this temple, the only tree on the Acropolis, an olive tree of course, is growing. And it's the Erechtheion which gives us the caryatids. And the caryatids, that's the name for the columns that are carved into the shape of women, which stand as one of the most iconic images from 5th century BC Athens.
We saw earlier that Poseidon had his fair share of affairs, and with his incredible strength, it's no surprise that Poseidon sired some of Greek mythology's most memorable heroes. Although sometimes the manner in which that happened isn't exactly what we'd call respectable. Building off an oracular proclamation from Delphi, Aethra, daughter of the king of Trozen, poured a libation to Poseidon, and in the middle of the night Poseidon came to Aethra, impregnating her. And 9 months later, Theseus, the hero of Athens, was born.
Next up, we have Poseidon raping Medusa. And one of the interesting things here is that sometimes Medusa's portrayed as this kind of hideous monster with snakes in her hair, and other times she's portrayed as a beautiful young woman. Regardless of that portrayal though, one of the things that we get out of this relationship is years and years later, when our hero Perseus cuts off the head of Medusa, out of her bleeding neck, we get the winged horse Pegasus and the hero Chrysaor. And these were sired by Poseidon during that event in the temple of Athena.
In an Olympian version of cat and mouse, Poseidon also pursued Demeter, goddess of the harvest. Demeter wanted nothing to do with him, so she turned herself into a mare to hide among a group of horses. Poseidon, as god of horses, saw right through that, and he turned himself into a stallion to mate with her.
Now the product of this messed up, incestuous relationship is a tiny baby horse named Arion. And it so happens that Arion actually has the capability of speech, a horse that can talk, an ancient Mr. Ed. Now, in less heroic children, Poseidon also sires the Cyclops Polyphemus. And this explains why he's so upset when Odysseus blinds Polyphemus, and that's why Poseidon takes vengeance on him once he sets sail once again.
Even though he lost the contest for Athens, Poseidon is still worshipped on the Athenian Acropolis in the Erechtheion. But his most important temple in the region of Athens is at the site of Sunion, on the far southern tip of Attica, the peninsula that Athens is on. The location of this temple makes complete sense. As sailors left Piraeus, the port of Athens, and sailed eastward across the Aegean Sea, the temple of Poseidon at Sunion would be the last thing they'd see as they headed out into the realm of Poseidon himself. Let's take a closer look at that temple. The temple itself is one of the most scenically situated in all of Greece. The ruins jut out into the sea, and from those ruins we can see that the temple was of Doric order, meaning that it had plain bowl-shaped capitals, columns that sat directly on the temple platform, and triglyphs and metopes surrounding the outside of the temple. Inside this temple, a cult statue of the god Poseidon, the embodiment of the god himself, would have sat in the naos, or the most sacred hall.
So the Temple of Sunion was built in the middle of the 5th century BCE, and it was built on the site of a previous temple that was burned to the ground when the Persians invaded in 480 and 479 BCE. Now the Greeks were eventually able to push back the Persians, and one of the cool things that comes out of this is that because the Persians burned so much, Athens now has a completely clean slate to rebuild. And so the buildings of both the Acropolis and the Temple of Sunion happened as a result of that Athenian Golden Age in the 5th century. Definitely go visit if you've got the chance.
It was mentioned earlier that Poseidon also lent his name to an actual city in much the same manner as Athena. That city, known as Poseidonia in antiquity, is now called Paestum and is located in southern Italy.
So ancient Poseidonia, modern Paestum, has 3 incredibly well-preserved temples. Now we know that one of them was dedicated to the goddess Athena, but the identification of the other 2 is still hotly debated. Some people say these were dedicated to Hera, but I think the identification of the temples with Poseidon makes more sense, especially considering the namesake of the site itself. And one of the things that you can see with Poseidonia or Paestum is that these ancient Greek city-states were located all across southern Italy and Sicily. And one of the things they did to compete with each other was build these massive temples as a sign of civic pride and wealth. So Poseidon very much is the god of the sea, but he's also a god of kind of wild nature and unpredictability. And all of these things are incredibly important in ancient Greek life. Most people lived on or near the coast, and people experienced this kind of unpredictability very, very frequently in the ancient world, so it makes sense that he played a central role. And finally, I would say that Poseidon's temples, although few in number, are incredibly spectacular. So make sure to make it out to the Erechtheion and Sunion and Poseidonia or Paestum next time you're in the Mediterranean. Just a few takeaway points from Poseidon, god of the sea.